Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started.
Пошли так.
Самооборони.
Are Indians and Indian students being used as human shields in Ukraine? This headline has dominated the news cycle in the last 24 hours. Russia made this claim soon after Prime Minister Modi of India spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The fact is, India says no Indian student has been taken hostage. India's evacuation mission is gaining momentum. But the panic remains, the fear remains. The conflict in Ukraine is intensifying on all levels, from the battleground to the airways. The Russian invasion is entering a dangerous phase. In the last 24 hours, the fighting has escalated. Major urban centers of Ukraine are under siege as we speak. Ukraine's biggest nuclear plant is now surrounded. The global community is worried. What if the Russians fire at a nuclear reactor by mistake? It's very much possible. The consequences will be dire. Tonight on Gravitas, we bring you all the updates from all the major centers on this conflict that we are tracking. Is Russia trying to drag India into the Ukraine war? It is day 8 of the invasion. Moscow has made a big claim. It says Indian students are being taken hostage in Ukraine and that they're being used as human shields in Kharkiv. India has refuted Russia's claim. Let me repeat that. India has refuted the claims made by Russia, but there is no denying the fact that the situation in Kharkiv is getting worse by the day. The city is being bombed relentlessly, and there are Indians in it. Look at this. This is what Kharkiv looks like. Russian paratroopers have landed in the city. There are growing fears that Russian forces might execute a violent takeover. India is concerned. An advisory issued yesterday said all Indians must leave Kharkiv immediately. But leaving is not going to be easy, given the continuous attacks. Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin again. India is pushing for an urgent evacuation and a safe corridor for its people. Russia said it would help. Next thing you know, Moscow has released a statement. And the statement made some big claims. It said Russia was setting up a humanitarian corridor, but what comes next is disturbing. Let me quote from the Russian statement. This is what it says. According to the latest information, these students are actually taken hostage by the Ukrainian security forces, who use them as human shields and in every possible way prevent them from leaving for Russian territory. Responsibility in this case lies entirely with the Kiev authorities. And this was not all. A Russian military spokesperson released another statement. This is what it said. Ukrainian authorities are forcibly keeping a large group of Indian students in Kharkiv. Ukraine was quick to deny this. Kiev said it was Russia that was holding the students hostage. I'm going to quote from the Ukrainian statement too. This is what they said. There are students from India, Pakistan, China and other countries who cannot leave because of the indiscriminate shelling and barbaric missile strikes by the Russian armed forces. We urgently call on these governments to demand from Moscow that it allows the opening of a humanitarian corridor to other Ukrainian cities. This is classic blame game. Russia says Ukraine is taking students hostage. Ukraine says Russia is blocking evacuations. Finally, this morning, the government of India spoke again and India refuted Russia's claims. India said it has not received any report of students being taken hostage and that many students, in fact, have left Kharkiv yesterday. Special trains transported these students out of the war zone. India thanked the Ukrainian government for those arrangements. The Ukrainian government. Interestingly and significantly, there was no mention of Russia in the Indian statement. So were Moscow's claims just propaganda? Why is there no humanitarian corridor yet? Have Indian students become pawns in this game of one-upmanship? These students and their families deserve better. Imagine the horror of the families, of the parents, when they hear claims of students being taken hostage. They're already living through their worst nightmare. Many students were forced to move to Soviet-era bunkers when the war began. Bunkers that have no supply, no steady supply of food or water. You see, there is no one to protect them. Yesterday, the Indian embassy in Kiev asked students to leave on foot from Kharkiv. They were asked to walk up to 16 kilometers for their safety. Hundreds of students made that journey. They had no other option. Thankfully, they came out safe, but it was a huge risk. Students walking to borders in the midst of bombing and shelling. As of Tuesday, 8,000 students were still in Ukraine. 12,000 Indians have returned. Just today, close to 800 Indians returned home. They were brought back by the Indian Air Force in 4 C-17 Globemaster aircraft. Government agencies are working on their evacuation, but remember, this is a war. There are no perfect plans. There are no predictable outcomes. The least we can do is not spread panic by hyping unsubstantiated claims. For the moment, we look at the situation on the ground. It is day 8 of the Ukraine war, and here's all that's happened since our last broadcast 24 hours ago. We start with Kiev. At least 3 massive explosions were heard in the capital. They triggered air raid sirens, which blared through the night. An explosion was also reported in a railway station. Women and children were leaving Kiev when the station was struck. Russia heavily shelled a town called Borodnica. It is to the northwest of Kiev. Now, most of it stands completely charred. From buildings to streets, they were all up in flames. Take a look. This is a place called Bucha. Again, not too far from Kiev. What you see is the aftermath of Russian airstrikes. I'll show you another village near Kiev. This one's called Gorenka. The capital and its adjacent towns were not the only ones shelled in the last 24 hours. Lviv, Zhytomyr, Frankivsk, Chernihiv, Odessa, Mariupol, Kherson and Kharkiv. They've all come under fresh attacks. This fuel tank in Chernihiv was shelled by the Russian forces. At least 5,000 cubic meters of diesel is burning as we speak. Mariupol too is burning. The city's mayor says Mariupol is being shelled continuously. At least 128 people are in hospital. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky had this to say.
Russia's missiles and bomb strikes of Ukrainian cities are a confession that they failed to do anything substantial on our soil. Chernihiv, Sumy, Mykolaiv keep their defenses. Odessa, they seek to ruin our Odessa, but the only thing they are going to see is the seabed of the Black Sea, as they themselves are a bottom.
A Ukrainian city called Enerhodar is home to Europe's largest nuclear plant. Today, its residents are all out on the streets. They say they will not let Russian troops enter.
Героям слава! Слава Україні! Героям слава! Героям слава!
Місто сьогодні, завтра і післязавтра буде постійно.
Героям слава! Героям слава!
Thousands are also out on the streets of Melitopol. It is located close to Kherson, the city that Russia claims to control now. These protesters are chanting, Melitopol is Ukraine. Gunshots were heard during this rally.
суки, по мирним людям стріляють. Мелітополь, виходь зараз, виходьте всі. Україна!
This is what Ukraine looks like after a week of war. Now let's tell you how Russia sees this war. The Kremlin has published images and videos of its quote-unquote special military operation. That's what they're calling it, not war, special military operation. In a first, Russia has also come up with casualty numbers. The Kremlin says 498 Russian troops have been killed in the war. At least 1,600 have been wounded. Ukraine says the number is much higher. As for Ukrainian soldiers, at least 2,800 casualties, nearly 4,000 wounded. A church in Lviv held a memorial service for the fallen soldiers. It is also collecting donation for those still on the front line.
We have been fighting and defending our land since 2014. So our war has been going on for 8 years. This escalation of the conflict that took place and the full-scale invasion is simply Putin showing his true face and openly admitting that he is at war with Ukraine.
Russia found itself isolated at the United Nations General Assembly. A special session of the Assembly voted in favor of a resolution. It called on Russia to withdraw troops from Ukraine. A total of 141 countries sided with Ukraine. 35 abstained. India was among them. So was South Africa. And very interestingly, China. It abstained from voting for or against Russia. But the United Arab Emirates, which had abstained from voting at the United Nations Security Council some 3 days back, decided to vote against Russia this time. And this only goes on to show how fast everything's changing in this war, be it diplomatically or militarily. Only 4 countries stood by Moscow at the UN, the usual suspects: Syria, Belarus, Eritrea, and North Korea. Now, here's something that one must note. The UNGA may have voted for Russian troop withdrawal, but it will not change a thing. The resolution is non-binding. At best, it is symbolic. As we speak, at least 1 million people have fled Ukraine. The United Nations is calling it the fastest exodus of people in this century. Never have 1 million people fled a country within a week. Russia is now being probed for war crimes. The International Criminal Court is investigating, and it will decide whether Russia committed war crimes in Ukraine or not. The court says there is reasonable basis to believe that the Kremlin is guilty. What happens if Russia is indeed found guilty? Honestly, not much. Russia is no longer party to the ICC. It withdrew in 2016. That was when the ICC had branded Russian annexation of Crimea a quote-unquote occupation. 6 years on, Russia has invaded Ukraine once again. At least 39 countries have called for an investigation. As we speak, all of these Ukrainian towns and cities are burning. Russia and Ukraine are meeting once again for ceasefire talks. They're happening in Belarus, just like the last time. And just like the last time, not very much is expected to come out of these talks. So here's a question. Could this war end in nuclear disaster? Not the kind you're thinking about. I'm talking about a nuclear accident, perhaps an attack on power plants or a leak from a nuclear reactor. In Ukraine, this is a real risk. And I will tell you why. There are 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. Together, they operate 15 reactors. Almost 52% of Ukraine's electricity comes from these plants. For any invader, these reactors are a target. You capture them, you plunge Ukraine into darkness. But a nuclear plant is not an ordinary strategic asset. It's not like a port or a highway. You can't just drop bombs on it or march your soldiers in. Nuclear plants are a high-risk target. One wrong move, one inaccurate strike, and you could unleash a massive nuclear tragedy. So naturally, Ukraine is worried. Russia has already captured one high-risk target, the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The whole area is now under Russian control. Ukraine says radiation levels are spiking, but experts say a nuclear disaster is highly unlikely. After all, the plant is defunct. The bigger worry is down south. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It is home to 6 reactors. It is the 10th largest nuclear plant in the world, and right now it is on Russia's radar. Their troops have already encircled the city. The question is, how will they enter? These are pictures from the outskirts of the nuclear plant. This is what Russia will have to overcome, a human barricade. Hundreds of residents, including the plant workers, have blocked roads leading into the city.
I'm grateful and amazed at the courage and heroism of our residents, who went out without weapons and built a human chain with a length of more than a kilometer and did not let enemy equipment and the enemy into the city.
That spirit is admirable, but it's also worrying. What if Russia escalates the offensive around the nuclear plant? I'm not talking about a direct strike. I'm talking about a mistake. This war has already exposed Russian hardware problems. Their precision strikes are not always precise. So what's the solution? Ukraine pushed for 2 demands. Number 1, a no-fly zone around the nuclear plants. And number 2, a 30-kilometer safe zone which Russia cannot breach. In other words, leave the nuclear plants out of the war. To discuss these demands, the United Nations Atomic Watchdog met on Tuesday. Its Director General had one message: do not endanger the reactors.
The situation in Ukraine is unprecedented, and I continue to be gravely concerned. It is the first time a military conflict is happening amidst the facilities of a large established nuclear power program, which in this case also include the site of the 1986 accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The safety and security of nuclear facilities and nuclear and other radioactive material in Ukraine must, under no circumstances, be endangered.
Statements done. The next agenda was to pass a resolution. Now, this is a sensitive subject. The International Atomic Energy Agency has a very narrow mandate: only nuclear affairs. Politics and power plays are not their business. But today, the agency made an exception. Their resolution makes 2 political statements. Number 1, a condemnation of Russia's invasion. And number 2, a Russian pullback from all nuclear sites. What does that mean? A, they must vacate Chernobyl, and B, they must not target other nuclear plants. Now, technically, this resolution is not binding. Russia can still take over Ukrainian nuclear plants. Having said that, it's another diplomatic blow for them. Here's how Russia's ambassador to the IAEA responded. And I'm quoting from that statement: the Board of Governors resolution on nuclear security in Ukraine contains intentional, politically motivated lies and mistakes. We asked 3 times to provide concrete facts in this regard. Total silence in response. This is what Russia says. Of course, Russia is livid. But here's a bigger question. We have seen wars before. We have seen airstrikes on strategic assets before. Why has this one triggered a nuclear concern? For starters, Ukraine's dependence on nuclear energy, 15 reactors, is a lot. No other war in history has been fought in a region so reliant on nuclear energy. Secondly, these are all old reactors. Most of them date back to the 1980s, and we do not know how secure these facilities are or whether they can withstand attacks. One big worry is the cooling system. To keep it running, you need 24/7 electricity. But what if Russia unplugs the power grid? What if an airstrike cuts off electricity? Worst case scenario, it could be another Fukushima. So when we talk about the nuclear threat, this angle must be considered. 2 Ukrainian nuclear plants are in the middle of the war zone. The other 2 are in the northwest, still mostly isolated from the fighting. There are 100 reasons why Russia should stop this war. This nuclear risk is another one. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my colleagues, our correspondents from the 3 capitals, among the many that are shaping this conflict. Nick Harper from Washington, D.C., Laura Macon-Isherwood from London, and Rosie Burchard from Brussels. Thank you all for joining me here. Let's start with you, Nick. America has sent additional troops to Europe. What can you tell us about their mission? And does the U.S. fear that the war is going to spill out of Ukraine?
Well, that certainly is the fear from the US president. Joe Biden has spoken about that fear, that he feels President Putin's end goal is to stretch beyond Ukraine. He feels that he's trying to rebuild the former Soviet Union, and that is the big concern from US military officials, and why we're seeing them send additional troops to those Eastern European countries. However, the president has made it very clear that those troops will not be stepping foot inside Ukraine, instead surrounding it, to be in those NATO countries. Because if President Putin were to step outside of Ukraine into, say, Poland, for example, the US president has warned that he, along with all of the NATO allies, would be prepared to defend every inch of NATO territory. So the US troops are there. They're there to support the mission, but they're also there for any potential Russian incursion into any of the other countries around Ukraine. The hope is that obviously that will not happen, but the President Biden has made it very clear that the US is ready should it end up being a reality, something that so far hasn't taken place. But drawing up those contingency plans has been very much top of mind for Pentagon officials over the last couple of weeks as they were warning about this invasion and then as they saw it unfold.
Laura, what's the latest on sanctions? We're told the British Prime Minister is under immense pressure to seize the property of Russian oligarchs living in the UK. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been criticised by opposition members in the House of Commons over the last couple of days. Plenty of other activists as well, wondering why he isn't going further when it comes to individual actors within the UK that have huge assets, essentially, and property that is within this area of the world. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, has met with a number of her counterparts from Eastern European nations today. She's gone and said that actually she now thinks all Russian banks should face sanctions. Previously, a couple of EU countries had persuaded the EU to allow Gazprom and other banks that are associated with energy to continue to work in those countries. But now Liz Truss is saying that all need to be included in those sanctions. And that is the way in which the UK thinks it can try to cripple Russia's economy, going hard with those sanctions, excluding banks, excluding individuals from allowing them to use the UK as a place to hold their cash or even to access it. And they are hoping that that impact could effectively reduce the amount of cash that flows towards what the Prime Minister called Russia's war machine. And they hope that that is the way that they can have maximum impact without moving any further, as you say, using the military or anything else like that.
Rosie, NATO foreign ministers are set to hold an emergency meeting in Brussels. What do we expect from this meeting?
Well, this certainly is an emergency meeting held in emergency times. Those foreign ministers of all 30 NATO allies are due to meet in Brussels on Friday. We'll expect attendance of the US Secretary of State Blinken, the UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, and all the others. So they will be locked in talks for the morning in Brussels, and we can expect them to discuss further how to beef up the alliance's eastern flank. So those are those member countries of NATO in Eastern Europe or in the Baltics that, of course, feel pretty exposed at this time. They've told other NATO allies that they do feel there might be a threat to their security.
Nick, Laura, Rosie, thank you very much for those updates and for joining us on this broadcast. Now, we keep saying that Ukraine is fighting a multi-front war. Well, so is Russia. Their army is fighting Ukraine. Their economy is fighting sanctions. Russia may win the first front. But what about the second one? Well, that could be a long and painful battle, the second one. The Western sanctions are direct and biting. They target almost everything: Russian banks, Russian oligarchs, the central bank, the state media, airlines, even Putin himself. Russia is basically cut off from the Western market. This in itself is an act of war. It is called weaponization of finance. What does that mean? You see, such tough sanctions are seen during wars. Peacetime sanctions are less stringent. And technically, the US and Russia are not fighting. So many experts are calling these sanctions an act of war. Looking at the numbers, they're right. Let's focus on the ruble first. November is when the Russian military buildup began. Back then, $1 was worth 71 rubles. Today, 110 rubles. That's a 50% plunge in value. What about inflation? As of February 25th, it was 9%. And what is the official target? 4%. Remember, this is before the sanctions were announced. By the end of this year, 2022, it could be 17%. 17% inflation in Russia. That's what Goldman Sachs is forecasting. They're also forecasting an economic collapse. Russia was expected to grow by 2% this year. What is the revised forecast? Minus 7%. Russia's economy could shrink by 7% this year. What about the stock market? I wish I could tell you, but the Moscow Stock Exchange has been shut for 4 days. It is simply not trading. Here's what I can tell you though. Russian oligarchs are feeling the pinch. Put together, they have lost $126 billion in the last few days. $126 billion. The Russian people are seeing all of this, the sanctions, the currency collapse, all of it, and they're responding with panic. I'm going to show you one interesting report. Putin launched the Ukraine invasion on the 24th of February. Overnight, Russians pulled a massive amount of money from their banks. How much? Around $1.3 billion within a day. These pictures should give you a better idea. Hundreds of Russians lined up outside ATMs. They wanted to withdraw money before the sanctions kicked in. That is precisely the problem. Russia may have built up impressive gold reserves. They may have de-dollarized their economy, but you still need Western technology. You need MasterCard and Visa. You need Android and Apple, and that is what will hurt Russians. Here's a list of companies pulling out of Russia. Apple, Airbus, Alphabet, that's Google and YouTube, Boeing, Disney, Facebook, Ford, Microsoft, Twitter, Netflix. The list goes on. Russia has not just been cut off from the 21st century market, they've been cut off from 21st century life. Where does that leave Vladimir Putin? He could look for backdoors, like cryptocurrencies, for instance. No single nation controls Bitcoin or Ethereum. They have special crypto exchanges, and most of them are opposed to banning Russia. Why is that? Because they say this is against their principle. The entire idea behind crypto is to eliminate government oversight, link people instead of governments. So crypto exchanges will continue working in Russia. And the numbers corroborate this trend. Bitcoin has risen 12% in the last 5 days. Ethereum is up 6%. And Binance Coin is up 11%. Clearly, crypto is a backdoor. The question is, how big is this backdoor? Around 12% people in Russia own cryptocurrency. That's simply not enough to blunt the sanctions. Plus, the crypto market is not a like-to-like replacement. And I'll explain what I mean when I say this. Russia's state-owned enterprises are worth $1.4 trillion. 1.4. The entire crypto market is worth only $1.9 trillion. It is not large enough to sustain a country like Russia. And this will worry Vladimir Putin. It should worry him. Already there is a massive anti-war sentiment in Russia. The last thing he needs is a recession. But that's exactly where Russia is heading. On Wednesday, the US sanctioned Russian oil refineries. The White House says Russian gas is also on the radar. And if that happens, it is game over. You see, America too launched long and painful invasions. They fought for years in Afghanistan and Iraq. But there is a key difference. They had multinational coalitions supporting them. They had no sanctions to worry about. Russia has no partners and all the sanctions. Like I said, Putin may conquer Ukraine, but the war could leave Russia broke and restive. Like we keep saying, this is not Russia's war. This is Putin versus the West. America is heavily invested. Europe is deeply involved, but the rest of the world is not interested. Let's focus on Asia. Many experts have called this the Asian century. Politics, economy, diplomacy, everything is pivoting to Asia. And the numbers support this pivot. Asia makes up 60% of the world population. It contributes 38% of the global GDP. So Asia's sentiment matters. And right now, that sentiment is clear. This is not our war. We saw this sentiment at the UN General Assembly on Tuesday. Most European nations took sides. Asian countries did not. Let's show you that list of abstentions again. Iran, Iraq, Kazakhstan, India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, Kyrgyzstan, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan and Vietnam. 2 others did not vote at all, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And 2 yes votes did not represent their current regimes, Afghanistan and Myanmar. So what does the list tell you? That Asia is not interested in World War III. All this talk of Cold War 2.0, all this talk of picking sides, the fact is Asia has other business in mind. And this attitude cuts across bilateral ties. Take Central Asia, for instance, the 5 stans. All of them have close ties with Russia, but not one of them voted in favor of Russia, not even Kazakhstan. Do you remember what happened there in January? There were massive anti-government protests in Kazakhstan. Putin deployed Russian soldiers to restore order, yet they voted against him. Same with American partners. India has consistently refused to pick sides in this war. So has ASEAN member Vietnam. The only Asian countries that backed this resolution were the ones that did not really have an option. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, Japan, and the ASEAN states. These countries need US military and economic help, so obviously they had to show support. But that support only extends to the United Nations. Outside the UN, it's every country for itself. Washington wants Saudi Arabia to stabilize oil prices. They want OPEC to increase production, but so far Riyadh has refused. Israel did not co-sponsor a resolution against Russia at the United Nations Security Council. That resolution would have been binding. So Israel did not co-sponsor it. This time, at the UN General Assembly, they did. What about the UAE? A similar strategy. They abstained in the United Nations Security Council but voted in favor at the UNGA. Then you have Japan and ASEAN. Both groups need US military support. Both groups face joint aggression by Russia and China. So naturally, they voted in favor. Japan may be an exception, but ASEAN is not. Their foreign ministers released a joint statement today. It says the ministers are deeply troubled. It also calls for a ceasefire, but guess what it does not say? Russia. The word Russia is not even mentioned in their joint statement. And that sums up ASEAN's policy. Do not interfere anywhere. Just mind your own business. In fact, that seems to be the strategy all over Asia. What explains this strategy? For starters, this is not their war. Conflicts in Asia rarely get such international response. The UNSC does not meet every day. The UNGA is not convened for an emergency session. Secondly, this is a crisis of the West's making. And I'm not talking about the war. That's definitely on Putin. I'm talking about the political issue at the heart of it. Whether it's NATO expansionism, whether it's nuclear deterrence, whether it's balance of power, all of it was created by the West. And now the West wants to drag the whole world in. They want Asian nations to pick sides. You can argue that this is not about politics, this is about principles. But the fact is, geopolitics is based on self-interest. Sometimes there is no room for principles there. Right now, Asia's interest is in non-alignment. And one Asian nation is of particular interest in this story: China. It is no secret that China has leaned towards Russia in this conflict. Beijing is like a silent partner for Moscow. It has condemned the Western sanctions. It has opposed the actions of the West and amplified Russia's message through state mouthpieces. But now China is changing its mind. Initially, it backed Russia. Beijing practically dictated when the invasion should begin. That's what Western intelligence claims. They say Russia asked China to delay this offensive. The request was made in February, we're told, during the Winter Olympics. And if that is true, it would mean that China had direct knowledge of Russia's intentions. And China did not ask Russia to stop. They asked it to delay the attack, wait until after the games are over. Again, these are claims, and they're not new. Many reports had predicted an invasion after the games so that the war does not overshadow Xi Jinping's big moment. Vladimir Putin was perhaps the most high-profile guest for the Winter Games. He met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. A statement followed. Beijing offered its full support to Moscow. It declared the China-Russia partnership had, quote-unquote, no limits. The statement was loud and clear. China had blessed Russian military actions in Ukraine. That's what it meant then. But Beijing now seems to be regretting that decision. 5 developments indicate that China has had a rethink. Number 1, Chinese banks have restricted financing for Russian commodities. This decision was taken on the second day of the invasion. 2 state-owned banks have imposed curbs: the Bank of China and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. They have refused to offer financing to buy Russian exports. Russian coal suppliers have been affected. Chinese power plants and steel makers are now looking for other suppliers. Seems like the sanctions have forced China to cut back on their dealings with Russia. China is also pulling back diplomatic support. And that's development number 2. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has signaled a shift. A statement came out of Beijing last week. This is after Wang Yi spoke to European and French officials. They discussed Ukraine. Instead of supporting Russian military actions this time, China suddenly called for peace. It called for de-escalation and a negotiated truce between Ukraine and Russia. Then the Chinese president called up Vladimir Putin. He asked him to negotiate with Ukraine, and this happened 6 days ago. So far, the Russian president seems to have not paid heed to that advice. Beijing sent more signals to Moscow. Development number 3. At the Security Council, it refused to use its veto power. It chose to abstain when an anti-Russia resolution came up. Moscow ended up killing the resolution with its veto power, but the lack of Chinese support embarrassed Russia. Reports say the vote on this resolution was delayed for 2 hours. Why? Because the United States was negotiating with China. America did not get China's support for the resolution, but it did manage to get Beijing to abstain. And more embarrassment, by the way, was in store for Moscow. Development number 4, China is now openly criticizing the Russian invasion. On the 28th of February, a statement was issued by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Allow me to read that for you. This is what the Chinese statement says. No country should unscrupulously damage other countries' sovereignty and security in the pursuit of its own absolutely military advantage and absolute security. China is following up those words with actions. Development number 5, Beijing is not helping Moscow. No assistance so far to evade Western sanctions. China could have helped. It has its own financial systems that can push through Russian transactions. But for now, China is not giving any lifelines to Russia. It seems like the China-Russia partnership does have its limits after all. What made Beijing change its mind? Why has China withdrawn support to Russia? It has not offered any explanation, but that's besides the point right now. The headline is, China is not completely in Russia's camp. Now, they say that when the rich wage wars, it's the poor who die. When weapons speak, civilians pay the price. And the situation in Ukraine is a grim reminder of these realities. Civilians are no doubt paying the highest price for this war. They've lost families, they've lost their homes. Some have even been forced to change their citizenship. But what about those waging this war, the soldiers on the ground sent to fight their neighbors in the name of protecting national honor with no choice but to obey orders? What kind of moral price do they pay for these acts? Do they even want this war? I ask these questions because we came across a video today. It's of a Russian soldier, we are told, captured on the battlefield. His Ukrainian captors say they showed him mercy and allowed him to make a phone call home. This is what the young man told his family.
Я могу сказать одно, я не понимаю, вот нахера все это было сказано нам, то, что нам говорили там в России. Здесь дороги у них, вот серьезно, по деревням везде асфальт, то есть освещение, все здесь полностью, все. Бля, а все, что по телеку показывают, это пиздеж. Я сам лично здесь сейчас, Дань, нахожусь. И я знаю, как это, я тебе...
You heard that. Everything they told us is nonsense. We've been left here like pigs. Well, this man was in captivity, so you have to take that video with a pinch of salt. Let me show you another one. Another prisoner of war. He was allowed to call his home, describing the war to his mother, trying desperately to hold back tears.
Все хорошо тогда. Я тебя тоже люблю. Давай. Хорошо.
Like I said, these videos may or may not have been shot under duress. They may or may not reflect the full reality on the ground, but they're still striking. They tell you how these young men are pushed into battles they may not really want, how they're sent to kill or be killed by leaders who see them as pawns. This happened during America's endless wars too, and it's happening again in the Russian invasion. Almost 9,000 Russian soldiers are said to have died. 9,000 casualties in a week. Russia's figures are much smaller than this, but this is what some other reports claim. Thousands have been taken captive, according to Ukraine. And Ukraine says it will not kill those captives, but return them home. Now, we don't know how much of all of this is true. It's hard to independently verify any of these claims. This may be an attempt to embarrass Russia, part of the Ukrainian propaganda. Also an attempt to undermine Russian public support for the invasion. Whatever the case may be, this is what Ukraine says it's doing, and it has set up a portal to provide details of their captives to their families. It is posting videos and photos of Russian soldiers so that their parents in Russia can identify them. And they've even urged the mothers of these captives to travel to Kiev to take their children home. Now, here's the thing. It's unclear what impact these efforts will have. It's unclear how much of this is propaganda. But the fact that Ukraine is stressing on the human cost of this war and trying to show civility during a war, as they put it, should perhaps push Moscow to reconsider how it plans to win Ukrainians over. And I have to say this, the source of a lot of these videos and images are from agencies, largely Western agencies. We do not have enough material on what the Russian side is saying. Having said that, these are telling images, and we want to continue showing them to you. We're wrapping the show, leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.